Okay, we just talked about the distributed firewall and all the cool stuff we can do with the distributed firewall. Now, traditionally with NSXT and what's now VMware NSX in version 4, the distributed firewall had to be or could only be installed on virtual NICs that were attached to NSX managed segments. Which meant if all I wanted to do was security, well, then I would have to, I would have had to build out NSX, deploy my managers, set up some VLAN segments, and migrate those workloads over from the distributed port groups over to the VLAN segments. Well, no more is that necessary, right? If all I need is security, distributed firewall as my my use for NSX. Well, now I don't have to do quite so much host preparation. And that's what this is all about. That's what this use case is all about, is simply using the distributed firewall on non-NSX managed segments. And that's incredibly valuable if all I need is the security aspect of NSX today. And that may be all I need for some environments, right? Maybe other environments I need the logical switching and logical routing, but maybe others, the distributed firewall might be the only thing that I'm looking for. Now, it's not just the distributed firewall that I can use here. I can get IPFix forwarding, and I can still use traceflow, and I can have malware prevention and IDS IPS and use NSX intelligence, licensing appropriate, right? All of these different things have perhaps different licensing, so validate that first. But we can use all of these different capabilities. Now, that does require that my distributed switch version is at least version 6.6. Meaning that version 6.6 of the VDS was introduced with vSphere 6.7. So I need at least that version of the distributed switch. NSX must be version 3.2 or newer or later than that. And here we are talking about NSX 4, so that would be later. That counts. This solution is for greenfield environments only. In other words, clusters that do not have NSX installed, right? There's no NSX on this cluster, and I want to prepare it for this security-only use case, right? That's what we mean by hosts are not prepared, or greenfield is they're simply not prepared. The hypervisors have to have the same VDS configuration, right? We have to have a distributed switch. This is not something that we can do with the standard virtual switches. So distributed switch only. And all of the hosts in the cluster have to have the same configuration for the VDS. Now, that shouldn't be a huge stretch. The cluster should be the configuration boundary, right? All of the hosts inside the cluster should be configured the same. If they're not, then I need to validate that. And then finally, because we're working with a distributed switch, we need vCenter registered. Now, the preparation is pretty straightforward. I need to deploy my NSX managers. We kind of have that assumption here that my NSX managers are deployed. I'm going to register my compute manager, my vCenter server, like we did earlier in this series. And then we have a specific host preparation just for security, right? Strictly for security that we're going to do. Once that's done, well, then we can start writing our policy using our distributed firewall. So how do we prepare this for security? Well, we come in through the system menu and we go to quick starts, right? This is not something we do through our Fabric interface. This is just through our quick starts. We select the cluster in question and we choose the install NSX dropdown and choose security only. Once we do that, we're going to see that the cluster object in our Fabric view, right, in our transport nodes view, our cluster object says security, right? There's a little badge right behind the cluster name that says security, and that tells us that this cluster has been prepared only for security. But the transport nodes have all the same information, right? We can see the version of NSX, and we can see transport zones and host status and all kinds of things like that. Well, why is that? Aren't we just doing security? We don't need all the transport zones and things, do we? Well, yeah, we actually do, right? Because that's part of the host preparation process. That's just how NSX functions. Now, you don't have to worry about creating a transport node profile. You don't have to worry about creating transport zones. We're going to do that automatically. And in that process, we're also going to discover our segments, right? We're going to discover segments, meaning that we're going to discover the port groups that exist on the DVS, and we're going to import discovered segment objects, right? Distributed port group objects for those so that we can do all of our security. So we can go into our transport node profile UI, and we can see the automatically created transport node profile. We can go and look at the transport zones, and we can see the automatically generated VLAN transport zone. And we can go into the segments UI. And if we look at the segments UI, we've got 3 tabs there, right? NSX, that was where we went to build our segments, our uplink segments for our gateways and our overlay segments. We did that under the NSX tab. We've looked at segment profiles, but we haven't looked at this distributed port groups tab. Well, the distributed port groups tab is where we put all of these discovered DV port groups. And we can see a direct mapping from vCenter, which we're showing on the left in our distributed port groups, to NSX, which we're showing on the right under the distributed port groups tab, where my distributed port groups are mapped one-to-one as new NSX objects, right? NSX is not controlling or creating these objects, but it's using them. And we can then see information about them. We can see, port group managed object IDs. We can see VLAN IDs. We can see the number of things attached, right? The ports on those distributed port groups and what virtual machines are attached to those port groups. So we have a lot of visibility here in NSX of this vCenter construct. We can also assign some segment profiles to these distributed port group objects, an IP discovery profile and a spoof guard profile and a segment security profile. We do these because these all have to do with security, right? The IP discovery profile, so we can discover the MAC and IP addresses that we're going to use in the data plane of the firewall. Segment security and spoof guard, so that we can have additional security features that we may desire. We can also use distributed port groups and distributed ports, for that matter, in our group objects in NSX. So we have these new characteristics that we can work with there to create our groups when we're creating our firewall policy. So this is just another example of the flexibility of NSX and what we can do. Management of the firewall is no different than we just talked about, right? Dealing with that, operating, locking sections, importing and exporting, those things are all exactly the same. This is simply another configuration case, another use case for NSX in your infrastructure. So take that and run with it where you need it, where maybe you don't need logical routing and logical switching today. Really cool stuff. If you come back, we'll talk about the gateway firewall and start wrapping up this larger firewalls section of videos. We'll see you soon.